Locationism, constructionism, and the brain. Do emotions happen in specific areas or throughout the brain? Locationism. Locationism is a theory that thoughts and emotions are generated in discrete areas of the brain. Historical findings. Historical findings support the idea that specific areas of the brain have specific functions. Phineas Gage suffered an injury that impaired his social judgment. While working on the railroad, the spike went through an area of his brain that we identify with social judgment. Broca's and Wernicke's areas. Patients with an injury to Broca's area, and we're looking at a diagram of the brain, and on the front part of the left side of the brain, patient's view is Broca's area, and towards the rear, underneath what is called the lateral sulcus, a fissure, is Wernicke's area. And in Broca's area, people who suffer injury to Broca's area are unable to express language, whereas in Wernicke's area, patients with an injury there are unable to understand language. So we see this pattern of people who have injuries to areas and aren't able to function that leads us to believe that these areas are responsible or at least involved in specific functions. Locationism is a part of pop culture. A little bit of a joke here, and there's a cartoon where the doctor says, whoa, that's a good one, try it, Hobbs, just poke his brain right there where my finger is. They're on the operating table and his leg kicks up in the air. Constructionism. Constructionism is a theory that emotion categories are formed from more general brain networks, not specific to a thought or emotional category. Constructionism versus locationism. Many constructionists do believe that areas of the brain have specific functions. However, constructionists also believe that these areas are tied together in networks and do not function as separately as previously thought. Background: the brain basis of emotion, a meta-analytic review. And this is the article we're going to be talking about. The authors conducted a meta-analysis, a study of many other studies, to determine if emotions were localized in specific brain areas or were generated through larger networks of areas. Outline: we're going to have an introduction, a method, results, and then we're going to talk about implications and conclusions. The authors put together a theory about constructionism and the brain, and then tested their theory against the older locationist viewpoint. One of the parts of their theory is called psychological primitives. Psychological primitives are thought to be the smallest building blocks of all our other thoughts. Example: danger. And we're looking at the picture of a bear who's roaring and pretty scary. 4 operations within the Lindquist et al. Model. This is what these were the building blocks for their model. There's core affect, categorization, emotion words, and executive attention. Core affect: representation of bodily change that is thought of as a feeling good or bad with some excitement. Categorization: placing a thought into a meaning category based on context. Pieces together blocks of psychological primitives. So you have these building blocks and they form larger constructs of cognition. Emotion words: this is a top-down process. So previous cognition, in a top-down process, previous cognition dictates later emotional response. Emotion words are the hub between categories and core affect. So if I see a cute bear cub, know as a category that this means danger, think the word danger, and then develop an affect for fear. In this way, the emotion word for danger ties together the affect of fear and the categorization of the situation is something that I should feel fear in a cognitive sense. Executive attention. Executive attention directs sensory input through different categories to produce an overall emotional sum. Executive attention can pick winners and losers in competing categories. For example, I see a bear cub behind plexiglass at a zoo. I know that the plexiglass protects me, therefore I'm no longer worried about the cub's mother. I'm mostly not worried about her. I still feel it a little bit. So introduction, summary for the article. If the four if the four operations model, core affect, categorization, emotion words, and executive attention holds true, larger network activity would predict constructionist theory. This is because emotion words happen in the left side of the brain, and also categorization and executive functioning occur throughout the entire front part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex up here. So therefore, if all these things are going on, then wider networks would be at play, and this would represent the constructionist viewpoint. Method. Participants in many different studies had their brains imaged while an emotion was simulated. The authors picked several regions of the brain to compare area of an activity in an fMRI magnetic imaging study. The imaging records activity in different areas of the brain with a set of very powerful magnets. If an emotion is experienced and almost all of the activity is in the brain area attributed to the emotion, the locationist perspective is correct. However, if an emotion is experienced and there is some activity in the brain area attributed to the emotion, but also activity spread out in a pattern to other areas, then the functionalist perspective is correct. This is an example of an fMRI not from the study, just to show what it looks like. On the left, we see the imaging for a person who's happy, and on the right, we see the images for a person who's sad. And these images of activity are activity above normal or what they were previously to the emotion being induced. Method continued. Named emotions and their assumed brain areas are independent variables, the variables we manipulate. The brain images of activity during our experiment represent the dependent variable, the variable we record to see if our hypothesis is correct. Results. Fear in the amygdala. So they looked at several areas of the brain across many studies to see if the pattern was localized or whether it was spread out. The amygdala is reported to be the hub of fear, of the fear circuit. So in the older locationist point of view, the amygdala was where fear happened, or most of it. Meta-analysis, the study of many studies, concluded that brain imaging during fear response was more consistent with the constructionist viewpoint. Brain activity was more scattered into networks outside the amygdala than would have been predicted by locationist theory. Results for anger and the orbitofrontal cortex. The orbitofrontal cortex is reported to be the anger center. So meta-analysis, the study of many studies, concluded that the brain imaging during anger response was more consistent with the constructionist viewpoint. Brain activity was more scattered into networks outside of the orbitofrontal cortex than would have been predicted by locationist theory. Results. Sadness in the anterior cingulate cortex. The anterior cingulate cortex is reported to be the sadness center when we feel sad. Meta-analysis, the study of many studies, concluded that brain imaging during anger response was more consistent with the constructionist viewpoint. Brain activity was more scattered into networks outside the cingulate cortex than would have been predicted by a strict locationist theory alone. Results. Disgust and the anterior insula. The anterior insula is reported to be the disgust center. Meta-analysis, the study of many studies, concluded that brain imaging during disgust response was more consistent with the constructionist viewpoint because brain activity was more scattered into networks outside of the anterior insula than would have been predicted by locationist theory. The anterior insula, a closer look at disgust within the anterior insula. I have another photograph, and this is for the brain image that shows where the anterior insula is. The anterior insula locations claim disgust. In the locationist claim, the emotion of disgust is generated in the anterior insula. People with injury to the anterior insula have difficulty recognizing disgust in another person. The anterior insula cognitive associations. In the constructionist view, the anterior insula is thought to be involved in awareness of body. So, if a person feels cold, clammy, or nauseous, the anterior insula is activated. Anger discussed in the anterior insula. This is interesting. Interestingly, anger activated a number of locationist centers outside of the orbitofrontal cortex, back when we talked about that finding with that area and anger, including the anterior insula. This is consistent with the constructionist view that a combination of mechanisms throughout the brain contribute to emotions in concert. So if the anterior insula notices bodily arousal, then anger would set off the anterior insula. Also, disgust is thought to be an evolutionary old emotion. The individual needs to avoid an environment harmful to it. Things that are nauseous shouldn't be eaten. If strict locationists are arguing from a perspective of evolutionary brain structures, this should have been a result in their favor if any were to be on the side of strict locationism. Discussion, limitations. The authors in this study introduced locationism as an absolute. Emotions only happen in specific brain areas. However, many locationists, quote unquote, do not take that extreme view. It would be a more challenging argument for the authors to compare their theory to a locationist theory that was open to more interaction of specific areas. Discussion, key points. So do emotions happen in specific areas of the brain? Answer. Mechanisms involved in the production of emotions do occur in specific areas of the brain. However, emotions do not happen just in these specific areas, as was asserted in strict locationism. Emotions are generated by a network of brain regions that include those areas and also multiple others, including those that allow us to enjoy or fear bears.